can have a seat. Thanks, guys. So, as I already kind of mentioned, tonight we're getting started on a 5-week sermon series, and it's titled Giants of Church History. So before I actually dive into our first person, I just want to talk for a few minutes about why we would even bother to do this, why study church history. Studying the history of Christians, right? I think there's not really a distinction, talk about church history or Christian history. But either way, what we're talking about is the history of Christian people, Christians who've lived throughout the ages. And this is something that gets done a lot less in churches than I think it should. Because there have been roughly 2,000 years, a little bit less than 2,000 years since the death of Christ and the arrival of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. And that's sort of the birthday of the church. It's been, the Bible kind of ends with Paul, and that's like, on a timeline that you're going to look at. And since the end of Acts, which is the latest thing that we have as far as narrative goes, there have been billions of people who have lived and died and believed in Jesus Christ. And they dealt with what it means to follow Christ in their time, in their place. And we live in an age where access to the lives, the writings, the stuff of all those people of the past is easier than ever before to access. So we should take advantage of what they have to say. I already read for you guys Hebrews 12:1. I'm going to read it again really quick. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. The cloud of witnesses includes figures from the Bible, right? Just before Hebrews 12:1 and Hebrews 11 is the great hall of faith, as it's often called. It's the author of Hebrews taking us from Abraham and Moses and going through all these people who revealed great faith. And so that's the context of the verse. And so the cloud of witnesses does feature all of these great people from the Bible. But it also features these people from the last 2 millennia of Christendom, of church history. Those believers are surrounding us and urging us on, this is what the writer of Hebrews says, to run the race that's marked out for us, to live the Christian life. So these people, these Christians from throughout the ages have asked the questions that we want to ask about our faith. They've struggled with issues in the church and in the world and in their own lives that we struggle with today. They provide us with examples, good and bad, and mostly somewhere in between, of how to live our faith, how to live lives as Christians. So that's why we study church history. It's part of our past, and it has something to say about our present and our future. And before I dive into the first person, since this is the first week of doing this, let me just say a quick word about how I'm doing the series and why I've chosen the people I've chosen. Because there are so many people. There's, almost 7 billion people living now, and about 2 billion of them are Christians. And obviously there hasn't been this many people throughout all of history. But what I'm trying to say is there's too many people to choose from who've done great things in the history of the church. We could do a series for years and years, if I was just looking at one figure at a time, of important people throughout the last 2,000 years. So why did I choose the people that I chose, those 5 to talk about? My goal is trying to cover a lot of ground, right? We're gonna have somebody tonight who's from the 1500s, and we're gonna jump back to the 400s, and we're gonna go work our way up to the present day. Last person will hopefully be somebody from the 20th century, not very long ago. So a lot of different time periods. I also wanted to choose important people that are like sort of 5 big names, right? Like people that you could go out, you could buy books of theirs, you could understand why they're like seminal figures, not just in church history, but in perhaps world history. So these are giants in the sense that they completely changed the world and the church and the faith through their writings, their actions, their ideas, all of that. So, even though I can't cover everyone, I'm going to do my best to mention other people from the same area when I cover somebody. And that way you guys are like, wow, that was such an exciting period in history. I want to know more. You'll have some more names to go look up. We'll see how good of a job I do at that. I also want to promise at the outset, these are not just going to be history lessons, right? I know that as excited as I get about history, that I am in the minority of people. A lot of people are not super intrigued by history. You guys don't have to raise your hands. Did anybody have trouble staying awake in history class in high school? We had at least one person who's honest enough to admit it. So I get it. I'm sure that there are people who've had trouble staying awake in history class, and there are probably people here who have trouble staying awake during my sermons, so combining the two could be just like a real, conk-out zone. I don't want to do that to you guys. That's not the point. I want these to have a point and a purpose. They're still sermons. And so even though we're going to be looking at lives from church history, they're going to have lessons for us about how we should follow Jesus and why we should listen to what they have to say, these people, and hear about them. So, all of that introduction aside, let's dive into the first giant of history, which not first or chronologically, but first on my list, Martin Luther. And the reason I'm choosing Martin Luther is because we're right up against a really big anniversary, and that's kind of what sparked this whole series idea. So, does anybody know, I'm sure I know a few people of you in here know, at least who've been to church in the morning, what happened 500 years ago Tuesday? So October 31st, Halloween. Back then it wasn't Halloween the way we think of it. But October 31st, 1517. Can anybody tell me what happened? Tony.
Luther nailed his 95 Theses to Wittenberg Chapel doors.
That's right. So, Luther nails his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg Chapel door. And it ignites a firestorm that changed not just the church, but all of Europe and eventually the world. And in order for us to understand why in the world nailing a couple of ideas onto a door could change the world, we have to go back in time and look at the life of Martin Luther up to this point. All right? So Luther's born in 1483. So just to give you some context, that's like, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? So Martin Luther is born before most of the world knew that there was an America. Before there was, this is right during the middle of the Great Renaissance that's happening in Europe. European civilization went through what we often call the Dark Ages, although that's a really poor misnomer. But there's a big chunk of time, about 1,000 years, where Europe is not the center of the universe, shockingly. The Muslims in the East pass them up. They're smarter than them. They've got better technology than them. The Chinese in the Far East have better technology than them, smarter than them. And Europe's just kind of sitting there squabbling back and forth. And then all of a sudden the Mongols happen, and they send a bunch of learners to the West. And then you start getting people like Leonardo da Vinci and people who just create this amazing culture. And we have what's called the Renaissance, which means rebirth. And that's happening in the roughly 100 years or so before the birth of Martin Luther. So all of a sudden, Europe kind of matters again. And Europe they're kind of these, what used to be just little squabbling city-states are starting to form into what we think of now as countries, like they're sort of united together. But where Martin Luther is born, that's not the case. Germany, as we think of it today, was not a nation. It was 1,000 little city-states, and most of them were controlled by what was known as the Holy Roman Empire, which some of you have heard me say and have probably heard other people say because it's the famous quote, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It was, again, a conglomeration of city-states that was kind of ruled by the Austrians. And I won't go into the long and really, really complicated history of the Holy Roman Empire right now. The point is, Europe is in this weird state where it's starting to come together. It's been in a really rough spot for about a millennium, but things are getting better, and people are more united, and technology from the East has made its way west. There's all kinds of new technology, like paper. They didn't really have paper. They were writing on parchment up until about 100, 200 years before Luther. Things like that have made their way to the west, into Europe, when Martin Luther is born in 1483 in Saxony, which is one of those little tiny city-states in what's modern-day Germany. And Luther grows up in a strict and controlling household. His father is like this dominating figure, and it's not all that uncommon in those days for a father to be the dominating figure in a household, to really determine what his children are going to do with their lives. And that's what happened to Luther. His father decides to put him through law school. And so Luther, at age 17, goes to become a lawyer. And he spends a few years studying law and philosophy and theology. And then suddenly, in 1505, at the age of 21, Luther's on his way back to school in a heavy rainstorm when all of a sudden a bolt of lightning strikes the ground like right next to him. And he goes cowering into a ditch, and in fear he cries out, "Help, St. Anna, I will become a monk." And he makes it through the storm. He doesn't get struck by a bolt of lightning, that's it. And most of us, if we screamed out something like that in fright, would probably not really think that much of it the next day. But Luther took his vow to become a monk seriously and immediately left law school and joined a monastery. And his father, as you can imagine, was not pleased. But there was nothing that would dissuade Luther. Luther stuck to his guns, and he did it. He became a monk. He'd promised St. Anne to become a monk, and so he did. And over the next several years, Luther tried to be the best monk that he could possibly be. And in many ways, he succeeded. He fasted, he prayed, he went to confession a lot. In fact, Luther became obsessed with confession. It was said that he would spend hours on end with the priest in the confessional and constantly worried that he might have missed something and that he'd go back and wake up the priest and be like, "Wait, I forgot this sin to confess." And I'm sure the confessing priest hated Martin Luther, probably. Luther said of himself years later, he said, "If anyone could have earned heaven by the life of a monk, it was I." He was doing everything possible to be as sinless as he could be, to live this really righteous, pious life. And yet he constantly felt the burden and the fear of sin. He was constantly afraid that he would not get into heaven, that he wasn't perfect enough, that he wasn't doing good. And during that time, while he's being a monk and doing all this stuff, he also shifts professions. And while he remains a monk, he also becomes a professor, a doctor of theology, at the newly created University of Wittenberg, or Wittenberg, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And that's a city in Saxony, which is the neighborhood where he grew up. And while teaching at Wittenberg, Luther has this great spiritual breakthrough. So like I said, he'd long been oppressed by the belief that it's only those who live righteous lives that would receive grace. That's why he spent so much time in that confession booth and lived such a severe monastic life. He believed, and it was fairly common belief at the time, that he needed to live right in order to be saved. Luther's understanding, though, slowly began to change as he did a study on the book of Romans while he was at Wittenberg. Romans 1:17, which is in your bulletins, says, "For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." Whenever Martin Luther had read those verses in the past, he'd heard the emphasis on the righteous part. It's the righteous who will live by faith. Who could live by faith, Luther thought, except those who were righteous? That was how Luther saw that verse. But as he studied Romans at Wittenberg, it became clear to him that the verse was saying the opposite, that the righteousness of God is given to people who live by faith. And that it's through faith that we're saved from sin and death. Not through our righteousness, but through the righteousness of God, which is given to us through our faith. And that was a critical moment for Martin Luther. Because suddenly, after years of pain and fear and the struggle to live an impossibly perfect life, all of that struggle was over. Luther now realized that he and everyone else could be free from the burden of constant fear about the state of the soul and salvation. And from that point, starting with that idea, Luther began to formulate other ideas that were based on it. He began to understand the church, not as the apostolic succession, which is how the Pope and others viewed their power structure, but he saw it, which, just to clarify, that means that the Pope and the bishops, they believed that they got their authority directly through a direct line that they could trace back to St. Peter. So that was what the church was sort of the governing body that had the authority of the apostles, the earliest apostles. But how Luther saw the church, now that he began to understand that salvation came through grace and through faith, he started to see the church as a community of those who've been given the righteousness of God. And through all of his theology about the church, about the sacraments, about everything related to his faith, he began to see a shift from human effort to God's grace. From human action, not as a means of earning heaven, not as a means of earning salvation, but action as responding gratefully to the salvation that we've been given through faith. And at first, those changes in theology were kept private. Luther shared them with some of his associates and friends at Wittenberg, but in general, it kind of just remained a quiet little thing. A lot of the people at Wittenberg began to agree with him, and he was teaching at Wittenberg a lot, so he started teaching students who caught on to his ideas. But it might have just remained a small little thing if it wasn't for indulgences. At the time, indulgences, the Catholic Church raised money through a practice of selling these pieces of paper that were basically a written statement that said you could pay and you'd shorten the amount of time that you or a loved one would spend in purgatory after you died. So, for anybody who doesn't know the Catholic doctrine of purgatory, having trouble speaking this evening, purgatory is the Catholic belief that there's a place where people who are believers go after they die to have whatever sins, whatever imperfections are left, purified and cleansed, and then they can go to heaven. And I don't really have time to get into the origins of the validity of that idea right now, but that's what a lot of Catholics believed at the time, and that's what a lot of Catholics believe today. And it was believed that basically everybody, except the most saintly of people, would have to spend at least some amount of time in purgatory. And the time varied depending on how much sin there was left. So indulgences would speed up that amount of time, or get you out completely. You could buy an indulgence for yourself, like I said, or for somebody who had died that you cared about. And there was this man named Johann Tetzel, who was a highly effective salesman of indulgences. And he went from town to town. He got good Catholics to buy these pieces of paper with these fancy slogans like, "Once the coin into the coffer clings, a soul from purgatory heavenward springs." So, fancy little rhyme will always sell your product. Martin Luther now has this newfound theology of salvation by grace, not by works. And he's disgusted by this practice of selling indulgences. And this guy, Tetzel, comes to Wittenberg, and Luther he gets really frustrated. He gets angry that this is even happening. And so what he wants to do is to start a debate about indulgences. And so he writes up 95 points that he wants to debate, which is the 95 Theses, and he posts them, he nails them onto the door of the Wittenberg Chapel, which is what happened 500 years ago on October 31st. And the door of the chapel, it's not really a weird place to put things, because that basically acted like the note board for, that's where you'd put something if you wanted people to see it and debate it and talk about it. And so Luther wanted it to be read. He wanted it to be seen by other people, but even he had no idea what was about to happen, about where it was going to go from there, what he had just set in motion. Because, like I said earlier, all this new technology had just come to the West. And one of the things that had come to the West was that had been invented after some inventions came from the East, was the printing press. And all of a sudden, you could make copies of a document very quickly, and you could spread them around everywhere with infinitely faster than you ever could in all of the centuries before then. And so some of Luther's followers got a hold of the 95 Theses, and they printed up 1 billion copies, and they started shipping them out to the rest of Europe. And all of a sudden, everybody's heard of Luther's 95 Theses. They've all read them, and this huge debate is now raging not just in Wittenberg, but across Europe. And that event, the nailing of the 95 Theses, is used kind of as a common shorthand point for the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. From that moment, the course of history is leading, inevitably, to a split in the European church. People are going to break away from the Catholic Church, which had never been, the church had only split once before. You had the West and the East, and they'd split about 500 years before this. But in Europe, in the Western Church, the Catholic Church, if you split from the church, that was it. You were a heretic, and you were either killed or banished. Everybody in Europe was a Catholic. And now, all of a sudden, history is leading us to these inevitable splits, and we're going to have churches like the Lutherans, like the Presbyterians, that's us, like the Baptists, and all the churches that we think of today in America that aren't Catholic exist because of this moment. And October 31st, 1517 isn't the moment when it actually, starts. I mean, there have been minor Protestant Reformation ideas floating around before that. Guys like Jan Hus, or Jan Hus, depending on how you want to pronounce it. I'm totally blanking now on the name of the guy who, Wycliffe, John Wycliffe, who translated the Bible into English in the 1200s. So some of the ideas of the Protestant Reformation pre-existed this moment. And all of the real splits aren't going to happen for another several years after 1517. But that moment, October 31st, 1517, is seen as the beginning of the Reformation for real. Because after that, there was no going back. So I'm going to wrap up Luther real quick here, because I know I've already been going long enough. Over the next few years, Luther defended his ideas many times, but most famously at what was called the Diet of Worms, which looks like worms, Diet of Worms, but it's pronounced Worms, in 1521, so about 4 years later. And he appears before the Holy Roman Emperor and a lot of high church officials. And the council demands that he recant, which means to turn back on his ideas, to say, oh, I was wrong, and to go back to believing and to reject his ideas. And Luther's reply has become one of the most famous things that he said. And so I'm going to read it. Unless I can be instructed and convinced with evidence from the Holy Scriptures, or with open, clear, and distinct grounds of reasoning, then I cannot and will not recant, because it is neither safe nor wise to act against conscience. Here I stand, I can do no other. God help me. Amen. And after that definitive statement at the Diet of Worms, Luther's branded a heretic, right? Which means he could be killed. The church could legally take him and they could burn him at the stake or kill him. And so he goes and he has to run into hiding to avoid death. And while in hiding, he does a lot of things. Most importantly, he translates the Bible from Latin into German, which, aside from Wycliffe's translation into English, was the first major translation of a Bible into a common language. The people of that day could not read or understand Latin, and yet that was the only Bible that they had. And so Luther translates the Bible into German, and that means everybody now can read the Bible. Well, those who could read. And those who couldn't read could hear it read to them in German, in the language that they spoke. And so Luther begins then to, from his exile, from his hiding spot, he's leading and teaching those who are going out and who are leading the Protestant Reformation, who are taking these breakaway churches, and they're teaching in the modern language, and they're teaching directly from Scripture instead of going through priests and other ideas. And Luther spends the rest of his life, not always in hiding, sometimes he can be free, but he spends his whole rest of his life debating, defending his ideas, and unfortunately sometimes with very harsh language. Luther had a very sharp tongue, and the older he got, the angrier he became, and he was not a perfect person. And I don't need to dive into a lot of it. There's some very anti-Semitic stuff near the end of his life that kind of is a black mark on his reputation. He's not a perfect person. His writings show that very clearly at the end of his life. And so, I want to make sure that you guys know that these aren't like, hagiographies, which means biography of a saint. I'm not saying Martin Luther's a perfect guy that we should, worship or anything. But he is an important person. Despite his flaws, he's an important figure and a great Christian person to look up to and to understand. Because he did all these great things, and he did them because of his conviction, because of his understanding about what it meant to follow God truthfully and honestly. So real quick, just to do what I said I was going to do, which is give you a couple other people, right? Luther's ideas influenced guys like Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland, he's got a fun enough name to say that it's worth looking up who he was and what he did. But he's also an interesting character because he's a very militant Protestant. He liked going to war. Then you had John Calvin, who founded the Reformed movement, and our Presbyterian Church is part of the Reformed Church movement. So we owe a lot of our theology and ideas to John Calvin, who was a little bit younger than Martin Luther. And then a little bit later, kind of the second wave of reformers, you had guys like John Wesley, who started the Methodist Church, and that became hugely important in America, especially. But anyway, so those are a few names to write down if you're interested. But just to wrap up here, Luther preached a gospel of grace through faith in Christ. So if there's anything that I want you to take away from my sermon today, it's that. Salvation comes through God's grace, which is given to us through our faith in Jesus, not through our own righteousness. And as you can hopefully see from Martin Luther's life, that idea alone is still revolutionary. It was revolutionary 1,500 years after it first came around. And today, even most Catholics agree that Luther was right about most things. Luther's conviction and his courage should inspire us, hopefully, to stand up boldly for our faith and for our convictions. In the face of overwhelming opposition and threats, Luther stood firm in his beliefs. And so my prayer is that the example of Martin Luther will stay with us and remind us to be bold in our faith, to examine everything, and to hold firm to the truth that we're saved through grace in faith in Jesus Christ. And with that, let's gather into groups and spend a couple of minutes in prayer.